as I say, that's the thing to do with your circles. Now, it's also mentioned with the higher circles in the Milner Royal Institute of International Affairs groups. They talk about interweaving circles, and once you, even before you get up the top of acceptance into, as I say, All Souls College, you have to interact with other circles, higher levels of understanding. So your tow rope, you might say, is becoming longer and longer if you've got the right stuff. All these things interconnect, and then they have the round table societies as well, where they hammer out all the problems for the think tanks. How can they implement policies across the world? What media should they use to get it across to the general public and get the public to accept it? So this is all a very ancient art, of course, of true governance, economic, military, social, academic, and so on, all the way right down the board. Yeah.
It goes back how long, you think?
Well, Freemasonry definitely pre-existed the 1700s when they claimed it came into being as Freemasonry.
Can I just ask something? Because I've been trying to read up about the Sumerians and Babylon and this, and it's not a coincidence that the MI6 building is modelled on the ziggurat, is it?
No, it's not a coincidence at all. Absolutely, this is an amazing thing. But even when the Rosicrucians broke out in the 1500s and the 1600s, they really were this same organization coming out with yet another name before they gave it the name Freemasonry. It was the Rosicrucians, because there were more people at that time still Christian in Europe, for instance, and so they had to have a kind of Christian-y sound, the Rosy Cross. But the Rosy Cross was also used as a fiery cross. We mustn't forget that too. It could either be a pleasant thing to look at, or it could be something you could be burned upon. And everything's got double meanings within their symbols, because it's based again on opposites in Kabbalah and so on. Very ancient. And even if you go into Budge's, he was the main translator for the Egyptian Museum, Sir Wallace Budge. He talks about how he had found, by perusing so much ancient Egyptian stuff and for translation, that he came to the conclusion that definitely Kabbalah, in its early form, not the 15th century later form, because they really finished it in the 15th century, but early Kabbalah was actually in existence in ancient Egypt, maybe about 500, 600 BC. So
I was going to ask you, do you think that the ruling elites now can actually trace their blood back to, Babylon and Sumeria and that sort of time? Do you think they've actually got direct links?
I am certain that certain ones of them do. Absolutely.
Do you think that's why they see themselves more as pharaohs and gods than people, don't they? That's why they're so obsessed with ruling. Is that what it is?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even in the pharaohs, they had massive genealogies then going back thousands of years. And that's never changed in all of the Mideast countries. Genealogies are incredibly important, even within Judaism and High Judaism. They're fanatical about keeping records going back for hundreds and hundreds, maybe 1,000, maybe further, so many years. Absolute fanatical about it. So there's no doubt whatsoever, genealogies, even the Bibles, they gave you the Old Testament. I mean, half of it is begatting, who begats who. So which lineage do you come from? It's so important to them, even in those days, and it hasn't really changed. Most people, mind you, don't even know who their great-great-great-grandparents were, but these characters at the top certainly do, because I say power and money has always made sure of its own perpetuity, its own survival down through the ages, regardless of conditions. They must always survive. That has never changed to this present day. Yeah.
And is this why they breed with common stock now and then? For example, you've got Kate Middleton and this Mike Tyndall, who's marrying Zara and Fergie. Yeah,
but don't forget that Kate Middleton too, as she's the 7th or 8th cousin removed from George Washington, eh?
Which one's that?
That's Middleton.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But I mean, what I'm saying is they have to mix the blood, otherwise they become inbred like Charles II.
Well, I don't know if you remember when Prince Charles was getting married, but it was over the mainstream news media at that time with the cartoons. They called them naughty at the time, in the cartoons. and they talked about him marrying. He was big ears and she was naughty. That was Spencer. And they said mainstream at the time it was because it was obvious in Charles that through too much inbreeding they were degenerating physically. And so by bringing new blood in, this would help to spread the gene pool a bit and maybe negate the terrible... I mean, if you look at Prince Charles, it looks like Akhenaten. He's got the big ears, he's got the scrawny long neck, he's got big hips. That's inbreeding, yeah.
And so the offspring, like Fergie's offspring now, they'll probably be married off to the aristocracy, won't they? They won't be allowed to have sort of common spouses, will they? No,
they won't be. Now, you find too, it was one of the few things that was true in the Jack the Ripper movie they put out a few years back there. The royal physician was also the royal abortionist. Because, you see, it isn't just kings and queens. They have hundreds of cousins who also have an entitlement to the throne down the line. And they act as, these particular physicians act as royal abortionists when they go a bit astray, you might say, with commoners. They go behind them and clean up their mess. And they were doing that in the 1700s, 1800s and so on, to the present time, yeah.
I understand. Yeah, no, it's quite, it gets bigger and bigger, really, the subject. It doesn't really... It just gets bigger and bigger. And just one more thing before I go. Did you see the article? It was actually in the Sun that they've started teaching atheism in schools over here now. Yes,
I have. I knew that would come, though, because the guy who set up UNESCO was Aldous Huxley's brother, and his brother was adamant that they'd have to eventually eliminate all religion and then eventually bring in secular humanism, the humanistic values. Now, secular humanism is a religion, actually, and it doesn't. The ones who promote it never mention that, but it's a belief system. But it doesn't surprise me at all, because from the 1500s onwards, even when Rosicrucianism came to the fore, their mission at that time was to destroy, and they knew it would take centuries, the prevailing religions, and they've been very, very good at that. And that's still promoted down through Freemasonry today.
Yeah. Okay, did you know anything about the Barcelona project or the Mediterranean project to amalgamate Northern Africa with the Mediterranean? Because I thought it's something not many people know about, and I thought that maybe this business we're seeing in North Africa now is part of that, because now we're going to see a massive influx from north to south, from south to north.
You're right. Under, again, the United Nations policies for regionalism, they've given out information on which countries will be merged with what other countries. They've even put Canada along with Norway and Greenland and so on for the times coming ahead, as they basically divide up the countries into little regions and segments, and probably sell them off too. I'm not kidding about that. So that falls in with the policy of, as I said, United Nations regionalism. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. Thanks for your help.
Thanks for calling. But yeah, it's fascinating, as I say, the reality that we have versus the actual truth. The truth is the hardest thing to find, and even when you do, it's in the odd book here or there where a little paragraph stands out and something is mentioned when you're half asleep with the darn book. And that's a trick, that's a trick of how it's written. But if you look again at Freemasonry, it's based, definitely in the West, upon, what's called the Old Testament. And if the Old Testament is read properly, because there's always an esoteric and an exoteric way of it, it's a how-to book, really, on how to survive, not just as a people, but, to survive and prosper by using cunning tricks. There's so many cunning tricks that even God approves of, you see, that it's astonishing when you compare it, for instance, with Christianity, which is kind of the opposite. And if Jacob even fools his old daddy to get the blessing, for instance, and that's okay by God. One of the main characters in the Old Testament gives his wife to Pharaoh, pretending she's like a hooker. And then he tells Pharaoh that that's actually my wife, and he gets rewarded for it because it was against the law to do that. So you basically got a big reward for for his wife sleeping with Pharaoh. It's full of these little things like that. And it's also full of how people can be tricked and populations can be tricked as well. And that's why it's used in Freemasonry on the esoteric level. It's quite fascinating to go into that kind of study to see how you can learn to be a dominant people or species or club or group like Freemasonry. And Freemasonry, definitely, once you go up the high degrees, you'll find nothing but disdain for the ordinary base people down below who are not in Freemasonry, and even disdain for lower Masons who haven't got up to the high degrees. They chat like arrogant fools to each other and how clever they are up in the higher degrees. Bill Cooper had an interview with one who had been a 33rd or 32nd degree Freemason. I don't know if it's up on YouTube, but if it's up there, it's worth listening to, because the guy said exactly what I just told you, that there's so much elitism and pomposity amongst them, as though they're the top of the lineage. And in reality, a lot of them just paid their way up there. Some of them can even pay their way up through the degrees if you've got enough cash to do it very, very quickly, even in a few weeks, even in a couple of weeks. So money rules it all. Now, as I say, getting back to All Souls College, you have to interact with other circles, higher levels of understanding. So your tow rope, you might say, is becoming longer and longer if you've got the right stuff. All these things interconnect. And then they have the round table societies as well, where they hammer out all the problems for the think tanks. How can they implement policies across the world? What media should they use to get it across to the general public and get the public to accept it? So this is all a very ancient art, of course, of true governance, economic, military, social, academic, and so on, all the way right down the board. As I say, that's the thing to do with your circles. Now, it's also mentioned with the higher circles in the Milner Royal Institute of International Affairs groups. They talk about interweaving circles, and once you, even before you get up the top of acceptance into, as I say,
about the Sumerians and Babylon and this, and it's not a coincidence that the MI6 building is modelled on the ziggurat, is it?
No, it's not a coincidence at all. Absolutely, this is an amazing thing. But even when the Rosicrucians broke out...
It goes back how long, you think?
Well, Freemasonry definitely pre-existed the 1700s, when they claimed it came into being as Freemasonry.
Can I just ask something? Because I've been trying to read up